and newsagents.
Well, Mick Lynch joins us now. Mick, can I call you Mick?
You can.
Mr. Lynch?
My mother used to call me Michael. But
Michael. Well, we'll leave that to her.
I'll be Mick.
Yeah. All right, Mick. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. You've been such a big figure in our politics over the last couple of years. Obviously, we've had this very sustained period of industrial action, not just from your union, of course, but from all sorts of unions. And you've really emerged in that time, although you've been on the union scene, as it were, for much longer. What's that been like, sort of suddenly becoming a very national figure?
Well, it's a bit odd. I never sought that, but the job I've got is to advocate our members' cases and the issues that are going on and what they face, but also the broader Labour movement. We're part of that, part of the TUC and the Labour movement, not the Labour Party, but sometimes working with them. So it's my job to articulate the case. I can't be the face of it, so maybe I can be the voice of it to some extent. It takes you by surprise a bit, but then again, people say nice things occasionally about, even if they don't agree with me, that I'm doing some kind of decent job at it and able to cut through a bit. And I think that's the main thing. And
there has been that real kind of split dual reaction to you in a way, hasn't there? Because on the one hand, I mean, I think in particular in the kind of summer, autumn 2022, early 2023, when you really sort of appeared, you were almost everywhere, you were ubiquitous on the national media. And there was this split reaction to you, one from particularly younger people, but lots of others as well, saying, wow, this is so refreshing. It's so interesting to hear these points from this particular political point of view put so stridently, but also so eloquently. And we hadn't considered those things before in some cases. But then, of course, you also have the more traditional reaction from parts of the media to a senior trade union figure, as they always historically used to call them, Baron. And you become a kind of sort of almost demon-like figure, sort of demonized. That's a sort of weird. You have both of those things happening at the same time.
But what I was pleased about, we were able to cut through the cliches. And what a lot of, they're not necessarily young journalists, but journalists maybe under 50, had to cut through this kind of cliche that they've been taught, that working class people are chavs, or they're not able to articulate a case, that trade unions have somehow disappeared from the world, and that problems that trade unions have to face down have gone. And what we were articulating was straightforward stuff that's been around for 200 years or more, about solidarity and unity, what we want out of society, which is basically a better share of the wealth that's created in our society. That's in our country, in our communities, but it also spreads out to the wider world. What do we operate this society for? In whose interest is it? Should it be in the interest of as many people as possible, or should we have wealth just moving to the top of society and not being shared equally? And I think some people, after the last 40 years of Thatcherism, I think we've got embedded Thatcherism in this country. I think that's where most of our problems come from. The idea of community and equality, real equality, sharing wealth through progressive taxation, through people getting better wages, having better work-life balance and a better deal at work entirely, being less vulnerable. People found that new, but of course it's what we were built on, because before World War I in particular, people were super exploited. They were exploited in a way that people now would not believe. And all of the issues we've got now about now called 0 hours contracts, lack of vulnerable work, not knowing if you're going to get a job tomorrow or work tomorrow, that's where we've come from, and we don't want to go back there. So what the unions are standing up for is progression rather than regression, and I think people found that new.
Yeah, but what was particularly interesting about you, I think, in that time was that you were so explicit and unafraid to puncture some of the kind of cliches as you've already described them. So I was really struck by the number of times, for example, you were asked by any particular journalist, well, you know, as a result of what you're doing today, you can just disrupt a lot of things. And you would just say, well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, if you don't have any impact in a campaign,
that's what I mean.
Whether it's a social campaign, if we go back to gay rights, we go back to women's rights, you don't get there by politely requesting it from the people who've got power. Now, I'm not a person of violence. I'm not promoting a revolution. I'm promoting change and rebalance. But you have to make some kind of impact. And we sell our labour as workers. Even yourself, everybody in this building is selling their labour. And it's how that labour is sold, what you get in return, not just cash, but the conditions you've got, that's really important. And you have to go back to these fundamentals of that economic relationship. There are people that are buying labour and there are people that are selling it, and there's a conflict there, and you've got to cut through that and try and create good agreements, which is what trade unions are about.
Would you think of yourself, and it's a bit grand, I suppose, in a way, but would you think of yourself in some ways as being, or trying to be, a bit of a kind of political teacher? I mean, in that way that's, for example, say, Tony Benn very clearly was, Margaret Thatcher on her side of politics very much was. Is that part of your mission?
Yeah, I think it is part of what you do as a trade union leader and as a trade union. I mean leader at branch level, in your plant, in your workplace, whether it's a shop or in media. The union rep, the shop steward, whatever you're calling them, has to be a leader. They have to use their knowledge, their experience, what's happened before, to inculcate that into new people that are coming through and give them some hope.
So, and a way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, a new way of thinking rather than what they've just been receiving. And there's a lot of good stuff goes on in school and college about the right to have equality. That equality is a thing that is good and should be provided to everyone. But what they don't teach is how to go and get it, how to reshape society, how to reshape the place you work or the community you live in so that it is more equal. And the way you do that is through good contracts of employment, through rebalancing work, because work is out of balance. The employers have all of the power and the workforce has very little. And we believe the way they get that is through organisation. But that's true in communities. We've got city councils and county councils going bankrupt, Tory ones, Liberal ones and Labour ones, because all of that democracy and power has been removed from them, the ability to make decisions. And too many people now think they're customers, I think. They think they're customers in society, and they're not. They're members of society, as they are members of a union. And so they've got to make their demands heard by taking action, whether that's standing outside the town hall, whether that's getting onto your local councillor, your MP. You need to know how to campaign and how to organise to get results.
But what is it like being demonised? Because that is certainly what happened.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, and I'm sure you're, what's that phrase my dad would say? Don't want to be unkind, big enough and ugly enough to to take it on the chin. Well, there you go. Not obviously talking about you directly, but you know what I mean. But it's being held up as like this guy who is, destroying the country to some extent, or stopping the country from functioning, ruining lives. These are all things that you've been accused of.
Well, you have to take strength from what you believe in. So I'm not acting this part. It's not just.
Well, you were called a hood at one point, weren't you?
Yeah,
I remember by Piers Morgan.
That's a laugh from my mates. You can tell why. If you look at me, the eyebrows and the haircut. It's not far away, but that's an old joke from the 60s. You know. But you have to take strength from your family and from your union, the people that have elected me. I've got to take strength from them, but I also do get great feedback. I get businessmen stopping me in the street because I'm all over London. I'm always on public transport. I never go by any other means, apart from my wife picks me up late at night from the station. But I get people who don't agree with me and say, I respect what you're doing. You're actually saying it the way it should be said, not like politicians, not like people from PR organisations. You get these people from British Gas or from the utility companies giving you a load of waffle about prices and about what they're seeking to do, and you see the water board people or the water company people doing it. Nobody believes them, even if they don't like what I say and what other trade unions say. I hope they do believe that we mean it and we're trying to do good for our people and for others.
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, that has been one of the big differences between this period of prolonged industrial strife that we've seen and say the 1980s, in that pretty much throughout, actually all of the polling seems to suggest that most of the public have actually been on the union side, even though we've seen significant disruption, and even though I remember it being said, well, that will fall off over time. Didn't really that much.
I don't think it has.
Why do you think that difference has taken place, that it is different now compared to, say, the 80s?
I think out there in the workplace, in our communities, in our towns, villages and cities, people feel that they're ripped off.
To what extent do you think the unions have won? I mean, obviously there's lots of different battles going on. You've had your own particular battle at the RMT. Have you won? Are you winning?
I do think we've made big advances. One, we've put ourselves back in the public discourse, in the public consciousness. We've stopped them doing the things they wanted to do to us. We've stopped them ripping up our pension. We are one of the last mass groups of people in a final salary pension scheme in this country. That was one of the things that we won early on in the dispute. They backed away from ripping up our pension. There's only 10% of people in this country who've got a defined benefit final salary scheme. Everyone in the train operating companies and network rail has got it. We've kept that. We've kept all of our conditions. Not one of them has gone. We kept all of our jobs, not one compulsory redundancy. We're going to have to win that battle again this year because they're coming back. Ministers had to sit in rooms and negotiate across the table with trade union leaders and reps. That hasn't happened for 30 years, where they had to go to the teachers' unions, general secretaries, Royal College of Nursing, Unison, and all of those, and do direct negotiations as government ministers and increase the funding. Now, it's not great. Nobody at union headquarters are jumping up and down and getting out the champagne corks, because we understand we're going to have to go back to it this year, and the pay round is coming again. Pay rounds are generally April the 1st, May the 1st. So negotiations are warming up now, right across all these sectors.
So there could be more strikes to come?
Absolutely, and I think there will be. Because
will be?
I don't think this government's going to relent. They're going to use all their money for tax cuts for certain groups of people. The best way you could redistribute wealth at the moment is to give modestly paid people, and I don't mean just people on minimum wage, people in 30s and 40 grand jobs, 25 grand jobs, they need a pay rise. They don't so much need a tax cut, because that pay rise will be with them for their whole careers forever.
I mean, what do you say to when ministers say to you, and they probably say it to you directly, they certainly say it on the airways, well, you've just made the point there about final salary pension schemes, and people say, well, there are lots of workers out there who don't have
Well,
that.
they should have them. They all had them in the past.
But they say, well, if we give it to you, then it impedes our ability to be generous in other elements of the public
Final salary pension schemes
sector.
and the investments they make are good for our economy. So we're members of a £40 billion scheme where we've saved the money with our employers, and we can deploy that for investment in our country if we had progressive economic policy whereby you're storing up communal wealth. And people used to understand that. Paternalistic politicians from the 50s, 60s and 70s understood the good of securing...
You're pining for Harold Macmillan, Mick.
In some ways, yes, because there was a consensus. There was a class breakthrough in 1945. There's no doubt about that. And it reset the model until 1978-82. And council houses were built, which is a store of wealth in our communities.
I want to talk about the past. I just want one thing on sort of contemporary... the negotiations you've been having. I mean, obviously, you and your colleagues, other trade union leaders, been in negotiations on and off with different government ministers. What is it like? What are those negotiations like, generally speaking? I mean, how do you find your interlocutors and your opponents, quote unquote, on the other side, generally?
Normally very polite. We are professional, and we know it goes straight to Rishi Sunak's red box and Jeremy Hunt. They interfere directly in what can be said in individual paragraphs in proposals, and they cannot make any amendment or any proposal until it's got authority, and it goes right the way through to the Treasury, because the Treasury and Number 10 do not trust the departments. So that's true in education, it's true in health, and it's true in transport. They won't allow anything to be done without the bean counters.
So what you're saying is when
it.
Ministers say, "Oh well, this is a matter that's not to do with us. This is between the train operating companies and the
it's a
unions
lie.
and so
I
on."
would call that a lie. If you get the contracts, National Rail Passenger Service contracts, it says on page 1, the Secretary of State is responsible for industrial relations of any train operating company.
Do you ever have much to do directly with ministers and secretaries of state?
I meet rail ministers, maritime ministers, because we've got maritime members. I meet the Secretary of State.
How have you found that you've had lots of different secretaries of state for transport?
Dozens, can't even name some of them.
Have you found, are there any who have particularly stood out, that have been particularly impressive, who've dealt with you well? Or
Grant Shapps stood out because he was completely incompetent, arrogant, and a bit of a prig, the polite term.
A prig?
Prig.
To be absolutely precise there, a prig with a G.
Yeah. And he's arrogant and had no knowledge of what he was doing.
In what way?
2 weeks ago, he asked, what's the purpose of the Royal Marines? And the Telegraph was foaming at the mouth.
But in
because
what way?
He knows nothing about the railways. I doubt if he's ever used it. He knows nothing about the world of work. He hasn't run a business. You know, you get this image that Tories are full of people that know about business. This is essentially a person leading a double life. He hasn't had the responsibility of running an everyday railway with millions of passengers moving about. And he carries the responsibility he's got so lightly and so shallowly that you've got to say this person is irresponsible. Now, Mark Harper, I think, is of a different character, but he's still stuck inside a different parameter. But he's astute enough to know I don't just go around bear baiting trade union leaders who he's got this view of that they're all thick and a bit useless. Shapps, yeah.
So you felt that Shapps thought you were thick?
Yeah, he went on today and said, what I'm going to do is get a load of agency workers. I'm going to break this strike and they'll be back to work within a fortnight. So he's going to get thousands of train drivers. He's going to get thousands of high voltage distribution workers, because we have 25,000 volts all across the railway, 750 volt distribution systems. He's going to get a load of guards and he's going to run the... That's what he said in the first week of strikes. We're going to replace these railway workers and all of these strikers in hospitals, in teaching, with agency labour. He's got no idea how businesses work and how the economy works, how the labour market works, and what it's like to be a responsible post holder, whether you're a train driver, a train engineer, such as I was, working on high-speed trains, who's got the responsibility of putting 900 people into traffic with your train. He's got no idea what he's talking about. I'm a complete and utter charlatan as far as I'm concerned.
So I think we could take it from this, Mick, that there wasn't much private bonhomie between the two of you.
He would refuse to meet us, and the first thing that Mark Harper learned, he had to get out there, and they were all instructed to then go and meet the union. So Steve Barker...
So Harper has been an improvement.
Harper is an improvement, but the position is still stuck in...
Because of Sunak.
Yeah, and we were able to get an interim settlement for the RMT at the end of last year.
Let's talk a little bit about the past, specifically your past. You are, as I say, you've become a very well-known face in Britain. You're one of the few truly working class figures in British politics, at the top of British politics, I would say. There are some, but there aren't many, like the media. Just give us a sense of your own background. What was it that made you a political animal, that fired political instincts within you?
Well, it's the way I was brought up. I mean, I left school a long time ago. I left school in 1978, which you probably found hard to imagine.
Well, I can imagine.
I worked under the Callaghan government when I was 16, the winter of discontent and all that.
You were working during the winter of discontent?
Yeah, I was at work.
In 78,
I was
79.
working as an apprentice electrician in a factory, making machines.
On strike?
We had some unofficial strikes in 1980, I think, after Thatcher got in. You didn't need to have ballots and all that.
No, indeed not. No,
go out the gate. So... yeah, I was brought up in an environment where the union was king. My dad was a shop steward. He'd come from Ireland, like my mum. We were brought up in that environment. I grew up on a council estate in Paddington up the road, which council flats. And if you went there in 1970 or 1975 or 1965, most people in that environment would be manual workers in a trade union environment, even in London, or working under trade union control, if you like, in smaller factories. So that's what we grew up in, and politics in our house was a big thing. Arguing it through. I was one of 5 kids, and everyone was articulate. I've got brothers in the construction trade, but one of my brothers is a teacher. My sister was a nurse. My wife's a nurse. That's just the environment we come from. In some ways, the skilled working class, that sort of background, and that's just what we grew up in. We are socialists. We're Labour Party supporters all our lives. We were then Labour Party members. My dad was a Labour Party member. He was a shop steward. That's where we come from. And
as you say, both your mum and dad were Irish. Is your Irishness important to you? Would you like to see unification one day?
Absolutely. I believe in a united Ireland. I absolutely believe in that. I'm not fixed on what the structure is, though. It doesn't have to be my prescription. I don't live there and don't vote. Yeah. I carry an Irish passport. It's up to the Irish people of every background to come together for that. And if people want to keep their British identity, they should be enabled to do that. If people want their Irish identity in the north, that should be respected. But I think if we build the peace and build governance, responsible governance and democracy, we will get a united Ireland.
Was it only the union that was the kind of summit of your ambition, or did you think, yeah, maybe I'd like to be a Labour MP, or I'd like to get more involved in the political element?
Yeah, I was involved in Labour. I used to go to the CLPs in Paddington and other places. But when I got to my 20s, I was moving about a bit like people do, sharing flats and all that. It was harder to stay involved, but my family's still involved heavily with the Labour Party.
And your union, of course, not affiliated to
We're
the
not
Labour
affiliated,
Party.
And I took part in that debate, and I supported that at the time. So we are still engaged with the Labour Party.
You're in the Labour movement.
We meet Labour politicians, senior ones, and we go to the functions. We go to the Labour conference every year and try to be involved. We want to push our policies. So we'll still continue to be engaged. But, yeah, so I was involved in party politics, local politics, the canvassing, going to the CLPs and all that. But the union side took over, and I didn't have enough time for that.
What do you make of where the Labour Party is at the moment?
Well, the Labour Party's in a position where they can win the election, and they've got to do everything they can to win it. I'm I'm a very binary person. We either have a Labour government or we have a Tory government that's going to be even more right-wing than the one we've got. That's the only way they're going. I am personally disappointed, and most people in my union will be disappointed about the stances that Starmer and the front team are taking. I think they've got to show their values. They've got to show they identify with working people. But the worst Labour government we'll get will be better than the best Tory government. That's my general disposition, and it always has been. That's not new. Now, in my union, I'm sometimes regarded as a bit out of step on that because that would be regarded as disappointing.
Well, something I think people don't often appreciate about you is that you are quite a pragmatic political
I'm very
figure.
pragmatic. I'm looking for solutions.
You're not an ideologue in particular.
No, I think ideology has been a crashing bore and a big mistake for the left internationally. The Eastern Bloc and China and all that, I think they've been terrible calamities, the ideological-based left politics. I think what Clement Attlee achieved in his period and what Nye Bevan and others achieved, and even Wilson and Callaghan, and others in Scandinavia and in Europe through democratic socialism and social democracy, has stood the test of time far more than ideological Bolshevism or whatever you want to call it, Leninism and Stalinism. I think that's been a calamity for working people and for the peasantry of those countries. So I'm on that wing, but that doesn't mean you're lily-livered and shy about what you believe in. I think changing our communities through public housing and public ownership is a real fundamental change. It changes the class basis of our economy.
Do you think that Keir Starmer is on the side of working people?
I think he wants to be. But he's got to find a way to be, and he's got to be able to tell people what he means. So if you take the 28 billion from yesterday in the last few days, he's trying to tell people I've got a green revolution, 28 billion. Most people don't know what he's talking about. It's a sort of technocrat.
It's a massive number.
If you went out to people and said, what we actually mean by this, in poor communities, in cheap housing, even in home ownership, we're going to make your house warmer through grants. We're going to change the way it works in this country. We're going to insulate your houses. Your fuel bills will drop. It's going to be a 10-year transformative programme. We're going to recondition and refurbish housing stock in Britain for thousands and millions of working class people. And while we're doing that, we're going to take some of the people in your communities and retrain them, reskill them, give them meaningful jobs. That's what the Green Revolution is. So that's 6 billion of our commitment. If you chopped it up of what you're actually going to do about greening our economy, people would start to understand it. But when you get two people arguing about the Office of Fiscal Responsibility and the OBR and public sector debt and all that, they go, well, what's this bloke on about? If it turns out that he's going to refurbish the housing stock on every council estate in Britain and make people's lives warmer and less worry about the electricity and gas bills, he'd get more cut through.
But do you think he's made a mistake on the 28 billion then?
Yeah, I do. It's disappointing the way it was presented. I think it's got to be presented in a way that people can consume. So they lost the argument on that at the beginning. Now, and if they're going to start retreating on issues like that, which are fundamental, which they highlighted, it's a worry that they're going to retreat on other things. But we've got to bolster them in a friendly way, but in an assertive way. I'm talking about the trade union movement. And what I've been saying to TUC leaders, the TUC itself and other trade union leaders and trade union audiences, we are an independent workers' movement. We're not tied to the Labour Party. There are more trade unions not affiliated to Labour than there are affiliated. There's only 11 affiliated. I think it's 30-something that are not affiliated. And then you've got ones like the BMA and the Royal College of Nursing that are not even in the TUC. But they are still part of the workers' movement, and we've been more engaging with those. And we've got to make the case that we want the society change. We want public spending targeted at the areas it needs targeting at, and that means opposing things like irresponsible tax cuts and things like that.
What are your impressions of him personally?
I don't know him that well. I've met him on P&O, if you remember the P&O dispute and the scandal about that. Yeah. He intervened on that in a very direct way, was very supportive. So I give people a tick box for that. If you're with us when we need you.
Well, he always says he's a working class, he's from a working class background. He says he understands working class people.
His dad was a toolmaker. And
Indeed, so I've heard that vaguely.
It's only me that knows what a toolmaker is, because I worked in a place where there were toolmakers. Sadiq Khan's dad was a bus driver, and you get this every time you hear them make a speech. So that's great. But what Sadiq Khan got, of course, was free travel as a bus worker. He got a final salary pension scheme. He got union negotiated rates. But Sadiq Khan's presiding over a situation where all the bus work is outsourced. They don't get the travel, they don't get the pension that we used to get. So if you want to claim working class heritage, you've got to give working class voters something from that heritage that can be restored. I've got nothing against Keir Starmer personally. I just want him to be bolder and more assertive.
You like him?
I don't mind him.
I've just damn him with faint praise.
I've just met
Mick.
you. I don't mind him.
Yeah,
but it's results.
Do you think he gets it? Do you think he understand? He claims to understand working class people.
I think he probably does understand it, but he's also getting input from bosses, from the employers, from the media, from advisors, from people in red braces and red socks who are going to tell him this is the messaging, from focus groups and all the rest of it. What I think he needs to do is get out onto council estates. He needs to understand everything that's going on. He's not going to get these messages from The Guardian and from The Observer and from think pieces. And the next election is not going to focus on identity politics. It's going to have to be about class politics, delivering change for working people. So if you want to understand social care, you've got to understand what the clients have been through, the patients and the people that are being cared for, and what the poor people that are looking after them have gone through over the last 40 years of casualisation. And precarious work and casualisation and outsourcing is a cancer in our communities. It's destabilising working class life, and that's got to be resolved. And if you can do that through the New Deal for workers, I'll say well done.
Do you think the left has, and this is not just in Britain either, happening across Europe as well, has to some extent at least forgotten how to communicate with working class voters? I mean, if one looks, for example, in France, and you see that sometimes this is overdone, but there is a core component of part of her new vote, which used to be vote for the Socialist Party, you know, in working class areas in the northeast of France and so on. And you see that pattern in other places as well. Is one of the problems, or one of the contributing factors to the growth of the far right that we're seeing in other countries in particular, just the fact that the left, and the centre left, is nowhere now with working class people?
I think, there's too much academia and not enough grassroots action and grassroots involvement. So if you want to represent the working class, you've got to be in the working class and of the working class. Now, Clement Attlee's one of my heroes. He obviously wasn't a working class person.
Very much not.
But he spent, as a youth worker, he ran youth clubs
in the East End
as a resident youth worker in some of the most impoverished communities. So he understood what he was on about. He understood about housing and healthcare, and so did Bevan, and he had all these people. Now, I'm not saying you have to be a bricklayer to represent working class people. You have to be there, present in those communities, which is why they shouldn't have distanced themselves from the trade unions as much, because the trade unions are the resource. They're the infantry of the labour movement that are going to be there delivering votes for them. But they've also got to be able to deliver policy back up the chute into what goes into the manifesto.
Just finally, I want to talk a bit more about class more broadly. I know it's something you care about, something that I think about and care about a lot as well. To what extent, how classist do you think Britain continues to be? How big a factor is sort of class discrimination? And also, even if it's not just active discrimination, but how big a sort of class-based society do you think we still have?
Well, there is a class division. There's a class division in every society. I'm not one of these people that believes it's all about accent and manners and whether you say lunch or dinner and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's about where you are in the economic structure. So if you sell your labour, you are working class. You could be a barrister and be working class. And over the last 2 years, many people who thought they weren't working class suddenly discovered they were. So barristers found out, and it slowly dawned on them, that they hadn't had a pay rise of any meaning for 10 or 15 years. And the only way to resolve that is to join with other people in the same position and take industrial action. And at the start of this, the two groups of workers were the barristers and the railway workers. Doctors and consultants have found themselves in that position. So if you're subject to what the economy can do to you rather than being in control of the economy, and there is still an elite of people in all societies that control the economy, that they own it, then they are the ruling class, and there will always be a problem. So what the job of the Labour Party and reformist politicians is to remove those barriers. And I think for a long time we were heading in that direction. And we were heading in that direction through the provision of facilities, provision of free education at all levels, and putting up these impediments such as student loans and other devices and keeping you in a lifetime of debt, and even home ownership itself. And the lack of public ownership creates more class division in our society. But what they try to do is put more stratas in. But people end up feeling at some stage that they do belong to a class, and they feel it all the time. There is an obstacle to progression in our country.
How profound do you think that is?
I think it's completely profound. I think it's deep-seated. I think it's the way the country runs. The country is run by people who decide policy. They have an inside track through the CBI, the Institute of Directors, all these think tanks that are set up to preserve their class interests, but they also get to run the culture. I mean, people don't have these great battles over who owns the media because they want to bring a different tone. They want to be able to control the messaging in our society. And the message in our society for the last 40 years continuously has been it's every person for themselves, dog eat dog. There is no such thing as community. There's no such thing as society. And what's broken through in the last 2 years, I think, is that that's not true at all levels. If we want a better society, we're going to have to join together. So the problems we've got with utility bills, with the state of our water, the state of the environment, is because we are not democratically in control of our society. And that's what social democrats and others should be pushing for, more control by the people.
Finally, Mick, for these sort of extended conversations, there's one question we'd like to end on, which is that if I gave you a magic wand and you could achieve anything politically, you can only do one thing, one reform, it would just happen and it would endure, what would it be?
It would be housing. It would be publicly owned, not social housing, publicly owned housing under the control of the people.
All of it?
As much as possible. There will always be private house ownership. There will always be a private rented sector. But we need a big public-owned housing sector that will renew communities, that would have architectural aspiration to it, that can remodel communities on a good way, in a good way that will enhance our social life and our social environment. That's one of the drivers of our country in the future.
Is there another chapter for Mick Lynch beyond the job you're doing, Mick? Is this it? Is this the pinnacle of your ambition? I know you do, but is this, and are you going to be doing this for the next 10 years or whatever it is, or is there another?
I'm subject to election by my members.
Well, indeed so.
And re-election. So
if they'll have you.
If they'll have me,
they'll keep you.
I'll keep going on. If they want me. We'll see.
We will see, Mick. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.